and to all the participants in this partnership. It is now my great pleasure and honor to introduce the 40th California for his remarks today, Governor Gavin Newsom.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Lieutenant Governor. Welcome, everybody. And it's good for me. I'm honored to be back. My birthplace, fourth generation San Franciscan. I had the pleasure of serving this city as mayor many, many moons ago. The opportunity to come back, I never take for granted, particularly in a city that, appropriately lays claim to being one of the most diverse cities in the most diverse state, California, and the world's most diverse democracy. A democracy that also proudly is the birthplace and home of the United Nations. That's where it started, right here in San Francisco, here in California. And we're mindful of that in the context of the world we're living in today, mindful of that in the context of the geopolitical struggles and challenges that we continue to face, but none more existential than the issue that unites us here today. With respect to prime ministers, with respect to presidents, certainly to God on planet Earth, is not any of the above. It's Mother Nature. She bats last in the vernacular of the American mind. She bats last and bats 1,000. I think Rob Watson said it best. She's only chemistry, biology, and physics, the most powerful force on the planet. And we are increasingly all reconciling that reality as the extremes present themselves in more challenging ways than we could have ever imagined. The hot's getting much hotter, the dry's getting much drier, the atmospheric rivers, the wet's getting much wetter. Here in California, it is indeed existential. The wildfires that we've experienced among the most devastating we have ever seen anywhere around the globe. The droughts, extreme droughts that we're experiencing even today, third year of a drought, the seventh year in the last decade of droughts here in the state of California, challenge us in ways that none of us could have imagined even 10, 15, 20 years ago. And so we have to disabuse ourselves from the stale rhetoric and debates around, facts versus fiction, people's feelings or opinions, and deal with those realities. People, lifestyles, traditions are being impacted by the nature of this change. Our kids are burning up, our communities, kids are living and experiencing, communities that are heating up, and we have to do things differently. And so we're here in that spirit, in that stead, but with a relationship not just to truth, but resolve and action, not just passion. We're here to exercise a new understanding, agreement, to accelerate our efforts, to learn from each other, because one thing that is not lost on me, and I know the Prime Minister, in the face of all of this, face of so much, one has humility, and that means we need each other. We need to understand not only our relationship to the world we're living in, but our own expression and experiences and iteration. The Prime Minister, I, and others in the delegation were just talking about some of the ideas and ideals we're advancing on electric vehicle infrastructure. Work we're doing here in California, the work and contrast strategies on converting old internal combustion engines. We were also at new technologies and innovation, and to look at this as an opportunity not just to change the way we produce and consume energy, but to create industry so we can dominate the next great global industry. Yes, there's an economic I don't know many nations that have budgets that large, let alone climate budgets, that have ever come close to the investments we're making. We're not just establishing thresholds of ambition. We're now in the how business. We're figuring out actually how to achieve them. That's hard and that's stubborn. And so in this document that was signed and document we will be formally exchanging, you'll see a pathway to exchange more formally those ideals through generated here in California. That's why I'm here. So I'm honored that I introduced the Prime Minister, how personally excited I am as well. We all watched her leadership internationally. A number two or three strangers are that claim to be members of my staff that joined us for breakfast. We'll talk later, you two. But it's an expression, I guess, of something that's not often expressed when it comes to these kind of ceremonies, and that's enthusiasm. So we're not just here formally. We're here proud. We're honored to have you here in San Francisco. We're honored to have you here in California, in the U.S. Prime Minister, the floor is now yours.
Kia ora koutou katoa, na mihi nui kia koutou, and what an absolute pleasure and a delight it is to be here with you, all of you, in these beautiful surrounds. I was going to say I literally feel like I could be in my own backyard, but I can't say that I have successfully grown New Zealand's native flora and fauna in quite the same beautiful way as it has been presented here to you in this space today. And it feels somewhat fitting to be here with the Pōhutukawa. Traditionally in New Zealand, the Pōhutukawa is seen as a connection between this life and another life. And for me, it feels fitting, therefore, that here we are on the other side of the world with this beautiful symbolism of connection between lives that we are amongst. It's also, of course, traditional for us to complete speech and ceremony with what we call waiata, with song. And so, Governor Newsom, before we came in, I acknowledged that you would be presented with a waiata, and it might not be our best work. But it came from the heart, if not the vocal cords. And so it was delivered with great respect. And on behalf of our business delegation, thank you for having all of us here. Lieutenant Governor, thank you also for being part of this event this morning and part of our breakfast and our talks. Delighted to hear you like the Flight of the Conchords. That means by default you love New Zealand humour. You are most welcome to come and join it and see it in person, and our hospitality in person, as are you, Governor Newsom. He's basically committed to a trip to New Zealand, everyone, I should acknowledge. You acknowledged, Governor, in the beginning of your opening remarks, the origins of the UN here. And New Zealand was right there and part of the development of that international architecture, and proudly so. In fact, right from the beginning, it was New Zealand who was also pushing for those progressive elements of the UN that we still continue to seek reform on today. And so for me, that demonstrates, I think, some of the shared values that we have. And those are reflected, again, that progressive notion, that desire for us to identify a challenge and not just meet it, but push further, harder, faster, is still what both California and New Zealand are still trying to do when it comes to the crisis of climate change. And as you've reflected, it is a crisis for you, it is a crisis for us. Just in the last year, the east coast of New Zealand, where my partner Clark hails from, they've had 5 severe weather events, 2 of which have been described as 1 in 100-year events. And this is increasingly going to be the case. So no longer is this something that we're talking about in the future. It is here and it is now. What's incredible Zealand, though, is that we have long been known as a nation that is clean and green. That is not enough anymore. For us, our sustainability credentials are part of who we are and our story. Traditionally in New Zealand, when we begin any speech or acknowledgement, we will start by acknowledging the whenua, the land on which we stand, because we recognise as a small island nation that we are nothing without our land and our environment, and both are under threat. And so we see that if we are to maintain our own notion of who we are, sustainability and climate change is the next frontier for us. And we are too small a country, self-confessed, with our population of 5 million people. We are too small a country for there to be distance between the government's approach on climate issues and the private sector's. And that's why you'll see such a partnership in our work that we do on these issues. And it's a delight today that we had the signing of an agreement here that is all about sustainability and ensuring that people can recognise the sustainable production and use of products like merino wool. And that's one example. Another is today delighted that Pākapā is announcing their new arrangement with Meta, providing services to 60,000 employees here in the United States. And it's all about driving greater efficiencies in the way that we're using traditional transportation. And Pākapā acknowledge the success of that arrangement. We have the Sustainable Packaging Company here as well. They're transforming ocean-bound plastics into packaging solutions and have contracts with the like of Victoria's Secret. We want to make sure that it's not just government, it's business, it's private sector, and we are driving the same direction together. But we need help. As a nation of 5 million, we won't have all of the solutions ourselves. We're trying to be leaders in the space of agriculture, food production, because that is our biggest part of our emissions profile. Making food for the world is costing our environment. But we believe we can be and will be and are the most sustainable food producers in the world, and we're destined to prove it. We need help on transport. We have set ourselves some very clear goals. Last week we released our emissions reduction plan. We're putting $2.9 billion, and for a country of 5 million, that's not to be sniffed at, Governor. $2.9 billion from our emissions trading scheme is being recycled into mitigations and adaptation work. And part of that, though, is our goal to make sure that we have by 2035 30% of our vehicles being EVs, but we need to source them. So we had a long conversation today about the kind of partnerships that we could form to try and overcome some of those supply issues that we have in New Zealand. And we also anticipate sharing notes on, for instance, the cash for clunkers policy that is already in operation here in this area, which we have just announced as part of our budget. So it goes, Governor, without saying, we have for many years had much in common. We have shared values, we have shared challenges, but a shared optimism on what we can achieve together. And given that already, as a whole of all the visitors we have from the United States, 25% come from here. This is an area where people make good life choices. We have a natural connection, and I'm so pleased we've put pen to paper today to confirm that and continue our cooperation on one of the great challenges of our generation. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
The Governor and the Prime Minister will now exchange copies of the Memorandum of Cooperation.
And we're here to answer any questions, if anyone has any.
I do have one. Kathy Novak from KCBS Radio here. Good morning.
Yeah, no, you were. I noticed the Prime Minister snuck off. By the way, when I was done speaking, no one sang. Y'all were quiet. Unbelievable. No, I'm learning a lot today. Yeah, no respect. Forgive me. Sorry.
So, Kathy Novak from KCBS Radio. Good morning. Prime Minister, you've come to California focusing today on climate change. We've also heard from both you and the governor this week speaking about gun control. And Prime Minister, you referred to these shared values. So when it comes to this sort of partnership, how much practical action can be taken between California as a state and New Zealand as a country? And is there a message being sent here in terms of the direction you both think that the United States should be taking?
Well, of course, the cooperation agreement that we've signed today, you see that very strong focus on environmental issues. And so that's today where we're really focusing in what can be delivered through this partnership. And I spoke to one of the very practical issues we face. The biggest challenge here in California, obviously, is that of transportation. It is our next frontier. And so I've spoken to some of the things that we're looking for. How can we progress and lift the number of EVs we're able to access, and there's text in the agreement around that. There's policy areas where we're keen to share data, information, and ideas. That's also documented in this agreement. So those are some of New Zealand's priorities. Look, more broadly, when it comes to issues like gun reforms, New Zealand has had its own experience, and I can only reflect on that. We were confronted with a horrific event on the 15th of March several years ago. And it was clear that the New Zealand public expected its politicians to find solutions and quickly. Now, are they the answer to all of our issues as they relate to weapons in New Zealand? No. But they were practical steps that we believed were necessary and that would make a difference. And so we made them.
Kia ora, it's Amelia Wade from News Hub from New Zealand. Governor, you have committed to no new fossil fuel cars. How important was that decision for you? And Prime Minister, why does Aotearoa's emissions reduction plan not contain a ban?
So as it relates to California's efforts, we signed a executive order a couple of years ago, becoming the first jurisdiction in the United States, one of the first in the world, to require the sale of all vehicles to be alternative fuel vehicles by 2035. We're codifying that through a regulatory process through our Air Resources Board as we speak. It was interesting at the time when we did that. It was particularly controversial. People thought we could never achieve that goal, that we weren't prepared for all of the challenges in the manufacturing, supply chain, and the like. It was interesting. Within 24 hours of that announcement, Bill Ford Motor Company, came out, put a tweet out, said, we're going to follow California's lead. We're not going to cede the future. We're going to follow California's lead. This was at a time a lot of the other automobile manufacturers were suing California and the Air Resources Board for our leadership in this space. The previous administration had frankly coerced many of the automobile manufacturers to roll back vehicle emission standards and to no longer follow California's leadership. Interestingly, now they're all signing up to our goals, proving the paradigm. Once a mind is stretched, it never goes back to its original form. In some ways, I feel like I may have been a few years behind in that executive order. The challenge, though, as the Prime Minister said in her remarks, is there is supply chain issues, so much so that we do need to be cognizant, particularly from a global perspective as we're competing with resources. And that's why we're mining for resources in the southern part of the state, Lithium Valley, one of the largest deposits of lithium anywhere in the world. Some have referred to it as the Saudi Arabia of lithium. And we have put in substantial investments and investments in people and place, following through on commitments from a social justice and environmental justice frame to make sure it's not just an extraction for this next rush, the lithium rush. And so our values are omnipresent in that respect. As it relates to the global issues and it relates to efforts to decarbonize. I don't think there's anything more important, certainly for California, but for this planet, than looking at the transportation sector. As I was telling, I'll close on this, the Prime Minister, 41% of our greenhouse gas emissions in California. This is California, fifth largest economy in the world, nation's most populous state. 41% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from the tailpipe, but you add an additional 10+% from the extraction of fossil fuels. So it's over 50%. This is the game changer. The old adage, you want to be big, you got to be big in big things. This is a big deal. And so our decarbonization efforts are a way of really moving the needle and continuing to move the ball forward in terms of our economic goals. And as you know, electric vehicles are one of our top exports. You see over 36 companies, headquartered electric vehicle companies in California. It's not just that big one that you all know that starts with a T. There's plenty of others right behind them that are looking to replace them. This market's about to get particularly competitive. I don't know, maybe it's a little analogous to what happened with Netflix and everybody else moving into that space. It's going to be interesting what happens in this space. And we want to take up as much space in terms of mind share and investment as we possibly can. Forgive me.
Thank you, Governor Newsom. Governor Newsom's answer really, I think, demonstrates the issue. Here in California, their biggest challenge has been, as he said, the tailpipe. Transport and the emissions derived from that, representing over 50% when you take into account extraction. In New Zealand, our biggest challenge is food production, and that's why you've seen us push very, very progressively on how we can ensure we maintain our position as being the most sustainable food producers in the world. We are the only country in the world committed to pricing emissions from agriculture, and we've done that alongside our primary producers. So we have demonstrated that where our biggest challenges lie is where our biggest focus has been. But our next set of challenges is, of course, around transportation. Now, we have been moving on that as a government. We set clean car standards to drive down the amount of overall emissions that we see from our transportation sector and the importation of vehicles. So it looks to achieve those goals, but uses a different way of doing that, which many other countries have used as well. But our next challenge is making sure that New Zealand can afford to make the transition to EV vehicles. Supply is incredibly important. We also, of course, have our rebate scheme to help support New Zealanders into low emissions vehicles. And now in the last budget, you saw us also announcing our scrappage scheme, again, to take out of circulation those vehicles that are contributing the most and also creating financial incentive for families to do that as well. But supply is critical. It's an area we think that we can work together. New Zealand does not produce. We lose nothing from our domestic market from a partnership, but we gain an enormous amount.
Oh, I'm Anna from Television New Zealand. This is not for the Prime Minister, I'm sorry, it's for the Governor.
Oh, no. Please, no need to apologise.
You'll be pleased to know it's the last question. Governor, given California's proximity to the Pacific region and given that region is so heavily impacted by climate change, talk me through some specifics, if you can please, on how that impact influences your policy decision making.
Well, look, I think the last 4 years taught us that nothing's guaranteed. I mean, we're dealing with existential questions beyond even climate around preservation of democracy in this country. I was talking to the Prime Minister, expressing a strong subjective point of view around how alarmed I am what's going on with so many states that are rolling back so much of the progress of the 21st century, not least of which issues related to reproductive rights, the rights of women and girls, gun policy and the like. So we're in a precious moment, and that requires us to do things a little differently. And during the Trump years, California asserted a different paradigm. It wasn't top down, it was bottom up. We couldn't rely on the federal government, so it was subnational, nation to nation, peer to peer. And it became even more important that we sign memorandums like we are signing here today with like-minded jurisdictions around the world. We did something called an MOU under 2, signed it with 220 plus jurisdictions, representing the majority of the world's GDP and population, to lay out the principles around Paris, the principles that were, of course, advanced in Glasgow. And it's an approach that we'll take in the Pacific. It's an approach we're taking today to advance those principles more broadly in the absence of federal focus, which is often the case, or federal leadership, which unfortunately was the case in the past. And so that's the paradigm shift. And that's why I'm honored and humbled that a prime minister would take the time to meet with a governor and take the time to advance those principles and codify them in a memorandum like this. Well, it helps. Maybe that helps a little. Nonetheless, I think that's the approach we'll take, and that's the approach I certainly look forward to taking as long as they'll have me. We'll know in a couple. I've got an election in a couple. We'll see what happens. I may take you up on New Zealand, maybe more permanent, though. I'm told it's harder to get residency there than it used to be, but that's another conversation. That's the burden of success. Okay, all right, I got it. All right. Well, I'll have to show some off when we walk back, clean up the coffee. Anyway, I think that's it. Is that it? I appreciate everybody.